I'm so happy you're joining us. Good afternoon, and welcome today to How Dashboards Can Help Your Nonprofits Achieve Their Goals. I'm Ruth McCambridge. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly, and I am a big fan of dashboards. So it makes me very happy to host Hilda Polenko, who has been our presenter, is our presenter on how to use dashboards well in your organization. But I think before she starts, I'd like to say that my experience in using dashboards is truly transformational. It's one of those organizational unifying practices that can get everybody talking about what they want to measure, and then are they making the progress that they need to make over a period of time. It's you can get people involved at all levels of the organization, both generatively and also in terms of evaluating your work. And there's honestly nothing exactly like that process for engaging a real learning organization, a single organization that is learning on its own terms about its own work. When used properly, dashboards are not only a great tool for monitoring, but for communication. And they help keep your organization very much on goal and on mission. You should never have a single dashboard for more than a distinct period of time, because things around you change and the way things happen change. But Hilda's going to get more into that later. It also helps you judge whether a particular theory of practice or a business strategy works, and whether the success in both areas align with each other. It's a truly horrible realization when you figure you finally got the right business strategy and you see that that's affecting your program numbers really badly. I mean, it's those kinds of things you don't want to have creep up on you. You actually want to make sure that you're measuring those two things in alignment with one another. So today we're going to go over some metrics and designs for different types of dashboards that do that kind of integrated measuring of stuff. Hilda is a CEO of what everybody calls FMA, but is in long form Fiscal Management Associates. And she's one of our go-to financial experts and a frequent presenter on NPQ webinars. We're thrilled to have her expert guidance today to help us maximize the use of this tool. Thank you, Hilda, for being here. Today's live webinar, this is a message about our sponsor, and this is the reason why you can watch this for free today. Today's live webinar is brought to you by AccuFund. AccuFund helps thousands of nonprofits improve their financial management with on-premise or cloud accounting solutions. AccuFund's reporting capabilities and intuitive dashboards enable sound decision-making and strategic execution of your mission. They integrate technology, consulting services, and industry best practices to provide a unique financial solution designed particularly for your organization. Just a few housekeeping tips. We are going to record this session and you will get a copy of it. You're going to have ongoing access to this webinar for free. These webinars are also freely available on our websites after they're recorded. So if you have colleagues that you think would be interested in this later, you can just tell them, go to NPQ's website, look for this particular webinar, and you'll be considered like the first on your block to know important stuff. So. Finally, we are on social media today, so you can follow today's conversation with our hashtag #BuildYourDashboard, all one word. Feel free to post any questions or comments in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen during and after the presentation today. So please feel free to use the question area freely. So with that, Hilda, I'm so happy to welcome you back here today and go for it.
Thank you, Ruth, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you in this holiday season to talk about dashboards and what they represent. And so let me get right into the topic of nonprofit dashboards and how we want you to be thinking about these. On the next slide, you'll see that there are different ways to think about the dashboards. First way of dashboard thinking is thinking of it as a performance management tool. What's an effective dashboard and how can it be used that way? We're also going to talk this afternoon about how dashboards and business models support each other. And so the dashboard is the mirror reflection of the business model and its implications with regard to your business, and more to come. And then lastly, I'm going to spend some time talking about what it takes to build a dashboard. How do we build it? I have some examples for you, and hopefully today's webinar is one that you'll share with colleagues and that you'll also have as a reference document to come back to as you take on the building of your dashboard or the refinement of your dashboard if you have one already. On the next slide, I want to talk about three critical areas of thinking with regard to it being a management tool. The first point is that dashboards start with key performance indicators, and you may have heard the term KPI. That's what that stands for. We want to be strategic in thinking about how many KPIs will we be looking at and what makes the KPI that you select the right one. We don't want to measure everything. We want to measure the right indicators that will get the attention to the right topics. In addition to that, we want you to understand that the dashboard is about course correction. So my second idea here is that understanding the performance of the organization is going to help you course correct. And I want you to highlight that term. There's another term that isn't on the slide, but I want you to correlate. Course correction is often an outcome from recalibration. So you recalibrate the way you do things, you recalibrate your business model, you course correct once you have a new perspective. And dashboards can be helpful with that. The dashboard with its key performance indicators will help you think through, what do I need to do? And how is that going to be action-oriented? The last idea here is that it focuses on strategic decision-making. So we're going to figure out what's key for us, keep it to a manageable level. We're going to figure out what course correction. So you'll hear me say action-oriented several times this afternoon because that's what dashboards are about. They're not repeating what's on financial reports or other kinds of reports. They're summarizing and bringing to bear the actions that need to happen. And we'll see throughout the webinar how that happens. As we move to the next slide, we want to just share really quickly, I'm going to go through a few bullet points of what does it mean for it to be action-oriented and user-friendly. And we know that user-friendly is often in the eye of the beholder. But in general, for most folks, really quickly, one, it's high-level metrics, and a few of them. It's a snapshot of the current status against targets. So that second point is about measuring against targets that you have had established. And you'll see when I go through my examples that status against targets is one of the ways that you can measure. A third item to think about is trends. So I always highlight that a number as of a point in time is not very meaningful unless you understand what was the number before, what was the number after, and what's the long-term trend. And lastly, these dashboards are going to highlight unexpected results. So if you think you're going down a trajectory and that is what the actual results are showing, we're on the mark. But if all of a sudden we see these variances or we see these items on the dashboard that tell us something isn't working the way we thought, that creates an action-oriented dashboard. In terms of the business model, on my next slide here, the dashboards can really be that high-level dissecting of your business model. So the business model idea for an organization is about a few things. One, it highlights the strategic priorities for the organization. So the business model is the coming together of, on my next point here, the types of revenues that drive the model. Do you have contributed revenue, earned income? Are you a government-funded organization? We believe strongly that for nonprofits, it's the revenue sources that drive your business model for the most part. The infrastructure and the activities that come from a contributed resource versus an earned income stream versus a government contract are very different. So in developing the dashboard KPIs, understanding the business model means understanding those sources of revenues and being able to identify, are we diversifying? What is going to happen in this coming year around revenue that we want to be alerted to? So again, types of revenue drive the business model, and you want your dashboard to highlight those important points. The next point to consider is, what are the major cost categories to monitor? Is personnel the really high element in your budget? Most organizations we work with are at least 80% personnel. So if we're putting 80% of our dollars in an area, we want KPIs that are going to let us know how we're doing in that area. And then lastly, it's about program delivery, right? So revenue, expense, we call those the drivers of the business model. But at the end of the day, it's about program delivery and impact and why we do what we do. From the perspective of the dashboard, it's really important that you reflect on what are the drivers of our program delivery. Is it enrollment levels? Are we an educational organization where success is defined by the enrollment and, of course, the outcomes? But from a performance standard, is it an enrollment? Is it a membership, subscriber? So you can see that answering this last point, what is your program delivery model, helps to then figure out which are the performance indicators that are going to tell us whether we are delivering on our plan. So this one snapshot here, I want you to go back to when you were thinking about the development of your business model and ask yourself these questions. What's the priority? That's really the critical priority for this coming year. What are the drivers of revenue and expense? And how will I know what programmatic activity I'm measuring and how I'm doing against that? In terms of building the model, or the dashboard, I should say, on the next slide, there's three things that I want you to consider. The first is, who's the audience for this dashboard? The audience could be the board, it could be a program director, it could be senior leadership. So Ruth mentioned in her introductory remarks that a dashboard isn't everything for everyone. And so the first part we want to think about is, who are our audiences and what will the dashboard give them? The second part is, what should you measure? So those KPIs that I talked about, remember the word key. So it's not every indicator, but which are the key indicators. And you may have key indicators for the board that are different than for the development team. I'll talk more about the different measurement possibilities that we have a little bit later. And then the last point to consider is, how should you visualize the data? There are different ways to present data with trend analysis and sort of red, yellow, green, and there are different aspects to it. And it almost depends on what you're trying to measure, which might be the best visualization. And that often is a function of the software, but you would make choices around which visualization approach you have. I want to dig a little bit deeper in terms of the audience. So let me start there. And on the next slide, I want to go through a few questions. I'm going to go through them quickly. I want you to be thinking about, gee, how would I apply this with my audience selection in my organization? So the first is, what does the audience need to know? What is that KPI that I'm trying to prioritize? Second is, how will I engage the audience? When we work with organizations to help them build their dashboard, we find that the process to getting to the dashboard, the selection of the KPIs, the engagement of the stakeholders is just as impactful as the dashboard itself. I'm not suggesting that the dashboard may even go into a secret room and come back with the perfect dashboard, because that will not make it the perfect dashboard. The more perfect dashboard is a dashboard that's been built together. The stakeholders that ultimately will be using it for decision making were involved in building it. There will be a sense of ownership and a sense of partnership with regard to what is being tracked and how it affects behavior. The third point to consider, or the third question, is how will it drive action? When you think of your KPIs and the way you visualize them, I want you to think this one question. What will the results be, and so what? If we're on course, no action needed. If we're slightly off course, what will we do? And if we're completely off course, what will that action be? And how will that action be measured? And then lastly, how will we get feedback from the audience? If you have a development process that engages everyone, the idea that we want to modify the dashboard is something you can agree to at the beginning. So for example, you might say, let's give this dashboard a year, meaning the board, we're reporting to the board quarterly. Let's gather any feedback as we go along, but let's give this a try for 4 quarterly board meetings. Then we can reflect and maybe make some modifications. If you have a weekly dashboard for program enrollment, you might say, let's give this a month and see how it goes before we modify. The key takeaway here is you don't want to modify the dashboard or any report for that matter on an ongoing basis, because the audience then gets confused or doesn't know what to expect. Come up with the design together, agree to it for a period of time, and then modify to learn and to learn together. And so these are some questions to think about as it relates to the audience that I would like you to think about when you start to think about this yourself. So the next part that I want to share is the second question, which is, what will we measure? And so on the next slide, I've sort of highlighted a couple of things to think about. Again, represents the business model drivers. So this is like your cheat sheet for how do I determine my KPIs. They reflect progress towards outcomes. So that's the second point. And the third point, they're actionable and then drive decisions. And one last word of advice here on my footnote is they're not forever. So again, maybe revisit them on an annual basis, a monthly basis, a weekly basis, depending on what the frequency is. But things like course correct and recalibrate, they hold true for the design of the dashboard also. So give it a try, work through it, and then revisit it. The KPIs are often identified at the level of the strategic plan. So do we have a growth plan? Do we have a sustainability plan? The theme of that strategic plan will often be the guide that helps determine which are the KPIs that we're going to measure. On the next slide, I want to give you a perspective of all the different areas that a dashboard can cover. So if we can look at the individual components, you can see we call this the 9 magic boxes, and some organizations have more, some have less. But I wanted to share, through the years we've worked with many different organizations in building their dashboards, and these are the 9 areas that we have seen focused as elements of a dashboard. You could have, for the board, a section that is the 1 or 2 KPIs for the 3 or 4 areas that are really critical, or I can have a human capital dashboard that goes much more deeply into the human capital metrics that we're measuring. So this 9-box rubric gives you the bigger perspective of what are all the areas that you might want to track, If you don't have a facilities, the bottom facilities and capital projects may not relate to you. But this is, for the most part, what applies across organizations. And I'll come back to this, this rubric a little bit later. In terms of the things to consider when you're actually designing the dashboard, on the next slide you'll see that it's either KPIs for the organization as a whole, and that might be your board or your senior leadership, or one or more priority areas. And you'll see that priority areas could be a department within the organization, or it could also be a focus point. And when I give you some examples around the financial indicators that we often see, you'll see that for some folks, liquidity might be a really critical issue. And you can assess liquidity by looking at various indicators that together give you the liquidity picture. We'll also see strength of balance sheet. If we're trying to measure how strong our balance sheet is, it may take 2 or 3 numbers to get to that conclusion. So KPIs for the organization as a whole, or KPIs for a particular issue area. Again, you could have 15 different dashboards for 15 different audiences. The question is, what are we trying to track and what actions are we trying to monitor so that we're in the right direction? As we go into the next slide, we dig a little bit deeper into what data will I be looking for. So from a data source perspective, we do not want the dashboard development to be the point in time when you're calculating information. If it takes a day to generate a dashboard, there is something wrong. That's usually because the data is not otherwise available, and it's the creation of the dashboard that generates the data. That's not the point of a dashboard. The dashboard needs to be generated on the assumption that the data is available, that someone owns it, the quality of it, that it's consistently available, and that the data can be measured. And so you'll see in my examples, does it come from the financial accounting package? Does it come from the fundraising package? Who owns it? It may be organized via the dashboard, but the data needs to exist in its form for it to be able to be reported on a dashboard. On the right side here, in terms of what to consider, there are questions about alignment. And again, where's the data coming from, and how will it help me reach my objectives? How will I behave differently because the KPI has been identified? So these are sort of general considerations as we think about what should we measure. And on my next slide, I want to talk about time frame. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier. I have 3 different time frames here. I bet you could come up with more if you thought about it. The first time frame that often is measured is this idea of current status. So where are we as of today? The next one is, how does that compare over time? And then the third is, how does it compare against plan? So for example, if I am in a growth mode, I know that when I compare over time, I'm looking to see that growth trajectory. So where am I right now? I'm expecting that I'll be in a growth trajectory, but I won't know whether I'm successful in that growth plan unless I measure against the plan. So if I plan to grow by 5%, I know that I'll be ahead of last year from a trend perspective, but am I ahead by enough? The measuring against the plan tells us, how are we doing against what we plan to do this year? So where are we? How does that compare over time? And how does that compare to what I thought I needed to do this year? 3 different elements of the measurement, 3 critical points that you may decide on a particular measure. We're only going to look at where we are versus last year. On another measure, we may decide we're going to measure where we are against plan. And we may have a measure where we do all 3. So as I go to the next slide, this is about visualization, right? So we've got these three things, or these three elements of measurement. I'm going to walk you quickly through different pictures, different ways that you can visualize data. And so the first one is a basic chart. We're lining up information financially, statistically, programmatic enrollment, just data. And if that's your first step before you get into pictures and graphs, that's fine. It's the first sort of basic element of presenting data. The second example is the red, yellow, green. And I think we live in a world where we generally understand what that means. The key will be when you develop those dashboards, and I have an example later, is determining when does something turn yellow and when does something turn red. In other words, how soon will I hit the panic button, and how much tolerance do I have for risk by saying I'm close but not far enough that I'm going to be in a panic. And you'll see that you determine using software, very easy software, Excel, automatically things will turn yellow, red, or green based on the parameters you've given to it. So you want the visualization software to be pre-programmed so that once you make your choices around what are the metrics and how are we measuring against plan, when will we determine on plan, slightly off, or off plan, once you answer those really critical questions, the rest is automated. A third example is where you might see components of a category. So you might see components of revenue, and you might see the three components. In the next slide, you can show it as bars. You can show it as sort of an accumulation. So example D shows the same information but in a sort of stack versus the bars. Same data, just two different presentations. The next example, item E, shows composition yet in a different way. Usually when you're looking at percentage of a category, you can look at it in that presentation. And then lastly, the example F is over time. So these metrics where we're seeing the trend over time, whether it's quarterly or annually, tend to lend themselves more to this type of layout. And you would be able to build dashboards on Excel, but you can also build dashboards based on the software that you're using. So when I give you my examples of financial health, because of course that's where we spend a lot of our time, you'll see that many of those can be customized within your accounting system. So as you're looking at what system you're using, I encourage you, before you even think about the KPIs, or as part of thinking about it, go to the standard dashboards that the accounting system has to offer. And those systems that are very supportive of nonprofits and understand the value of dashboards have been investing in customizing dashboards more. So take a look at what's available. You want to have the right KPIs, but the easier it is to generate, the better. And so take a look at accounting software, take a look at the development software, your program database. The more that you can program within the database that the data lives, the more automatable it will be and the more efficient the process will be. But this is to give you ideas as to the different ways you can visualize something. As I go on now to give you some examples, and again, quickly, we're going to measure current status, trend over time, and against plan. Those are the three ways that we can measure information. So let me bring you back to the 9-box rubric that I shared with you earlier. On the next slide, you can see that there are the 9 boxes, and I want to emphasize financial health. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into that particular metric. At the end of the webinar, in the resources section, I have a link for you if you would like to see typically what do nonprofits measure in each of these 9 boxes. There's a tool we've developed that you can download that will show you what are the typical KPIs. In financial health, I thought I would share a few with you so that you can see how one might think about which ones do I measure. So in the next slide, I have presented the 9, and there's no magic to 9, it just happens to be that we have 9 examples of what do people measure, what do organizations measure when they're thinking about financial health. And for those of you who have watched our webinars before, you might remember that LUNA stands for Liquid Unrestricted Net Assets. It's our favorite acronym. It represents liquid reserves for an organization. And you can see that you can measure LUNA, you can measure months of LUNA. So how many months of operation would you be able to cover with your LUNA balance? You can look at your net asset composition, and you can see, I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can see it's around composition of net assets, of revenue, expense. The 3 that are highlighted in blue are the 3 that we recommend be thought about as when you're thinking about financial health. Overall, we think months of reserves, months of cash, and the historical trend of operating surpluses or deficits, when you take those 3 together, they are the greatest indicators of financial health overall. Is it better to see all 9? Sure, if you're trying to understand all the drivers, but if you're trying to think of what are the 3 or 4 critical indicators for the board to keep an eye on in terms of financial health, especially over time, these are the 3 that we have found most often identified as the top indicators of overall financial health. On the next slide, I am picking liquidity as of the current time as an issue area. So remember that we said we could be measuring for the organization as a whole, or we could be measuring one particular area. So as we look at what is in liquidity, you will see that there are 5 different boxes. Months of cash or days of cash, if we're really thinly capitalized in terms of liquidity. There's the cash flow projections. What are we seeing coming in the next few months and going out? There's the age of receivables, and then there's the age of payables. And then lastly, there's the available credit line. So if you have a line of credit that you draw from, when will we draw from the line of credit is often a function of how much cash we have available, what we're expecting in the future, how old our receivables and payables are. So we found that if you had one page in your board package or in your senior leadership package, and you wanted the message to be around liquidity, these would be 5 really good indicators of the financial liquidity of the organization. So again, these are 5. You might decide on a slightly different composition. The key is you're going to see themes. If payables start to increase, if the cash that's expected is not very strong in the next few months, it may need to trigger a draw from the credit line. If you choose credit line, I encourage you to always report the total credit line available, the amount drawn to date, and what remains available, so that the board or anyone who is seeing this, the audience, could see how much more runway do we have from the credit line. So there are action steps that these KPIs will give the reader. So that's liquidity, just as an example that I thought would be helpful to envision. The next example is around strength of balance sheet. And the strength of balance sheet as of today is important, but it's also very important that you understand the trend over time. So in this case, I have 4 indicators that I've identified as really important KPIs to measure strength of balance sheet. And the first is LUNA. Remember, LUNA is your reserves. So if your reserves over time are getting stronger, that's a very good indication of financial strength. If your LUNA balance is getting smaller, the LUNA is the liquid unrestricted net assets, then that could be a situation where the organization's financial strength is weakening. And that would call for action from the leadership. The second indicator is the month of Luna, especially in organizations that are growing. Luna is a balance, right? So it's 100,000, a million, whatever the reserve balance is. But is it enough is a function of the size of your operation. So measuring Luna is important, but in combination with months of Luna, it's a really important indicator, meaning if I'm growing by 20% a year, the amount that I need to remain at a 3-month reserve is going to grow with each annual operating budget growing. So we want to see our Luna balance, but we want to see how many months of operations. And if our goal is to have 2 months or 3 months of reserves, we know from a strategic priority we have to figure out how we're going to get there. The next is the months or days of cash on hand. And then lastly, the net asset composition. So we want to see, are we becoming very, very restricted in terms of the net asset that we have at the end of the year? Are we becoming more liquid? Are we growing in net asset? Are we depleting our net assets? These are really good indicators of the strength of that balance sheet and the liquidity of that balance sheet as well. The months or days of cash on hand may or may not be the same as reserves, especially if organizations have heavy funding that's restricted. I often worry that just looking at cash on hand may lead an organization to believe that they're stronger than they really are. So if you have restricted funds that come in the form of cash, you want to make sure that you also differentiate the months of Luna and the Luna balance, because Luna is unrestricted and it would not include those restricted balances. So cash is important, but reserves is really important that we know the difference. So that's strength of balance sheet. I have on the next slide an example. Warning, this type is really small, and when you download the slides, you'll be able to look a little bit closer. But I wanted to share this example with you, which tracks these 4 indicators to show that sometimes the dashboard is not just numbers and pictures. Sometimes it's words. And that's your choice, what you put on a dashboard. For this example, this organization wanted to use words because they wanted to remind the reader what they're looking at. And so there were graphs and charts and trend lines, but there were also words. And that's just to remind us that it could be a combination of all 3 if you think that would be most helpful for your audience. On the next slide, I want to show that last example of against plan. So just using operating results, we know that that's revenue, expense, and operating surplus or deficit. Those are the 3 elements of an operating result. And on the next slide, we have an example. And this example, very, very basic. You'll see there's a link here to the Strong Nonprofits website, which you've heard us talk about in prior webinars. And this dashboard is built on Excel. At the Strong Nonprofits site, you can Google for that or look up dashboard, and you can download this Excel-based template. You can format it to your specifics, and you'll see that in this case, when I talked about we're close but not in trouble yet, that decision, this organization chose 5%. So if we're within 5% of where we thought we were going to be, we're close. If we're above 5%, then we've met and we've exceeded. If we were more than 5%, that might turn into red. And so totally customizable, very easy to just get started if you're looking for a quick way. And you can add more indicators. I've seen 5, I've seen 6. This is for you, and you can add notes if you'd like. But again, this is an example of red, yellow, green is against plan. And the final dashboard example slide, it's about revenue and expense budget versus actual. So the first example was red, yellow, green. It already had a conclusion. The dashboard had already determined that we're either in the green or we're in the red or we're somewhere in between. And we often talk about Do you go spend all your time in red? We certainly need to do that because you need to course correct for anything that's off course. But you also want to focus on yellow, right? Because if we focus on results that are in the yellow zone, we might just turn them into green before they get to red. And then lastly, we also want to focus on the green. What's going right? What are we doing that's helping us exceed goals? So it's not to say focus on one versus another. It's focusing with a different perspective. What are we celebrating in green? What do we have to quickly turn around in yellow? And what are some of the more long-term adjustments we need to make in the red? That was on the last slide. On this slide, you can see that there's this is another way to show revenue and expense. In this organization, the original budget was a surplus of about $300,000. The actual is a surplus of $200,000, but that's not enough. If we see what's happening with revenue and expense, you can see that both revenues and expenses have changed. They've not changed, but they've exceeded the original plan so that it's a $2.8 million organization instead of a 2.5, but they were able to recalibrate and get to a similar result. The last example, again, small print, you'll be able to see it in a larger font, is an example of program enrollment. So if we could just see the next example, you can see that this is sort of like the 2.0 version, right? In this example, we're tracking enrollment for last year and for 2 years, 14 and 15. Enrollment budget for this year. So what was it last year? What was the budget for 15? What's the actual for 15? But there's also a maximum capacity bar. And where you've got program delivery that you can't just grow endlessly, there's a point where you just cannot exceed capacity, this is also very helpful. So for organizations that are attendance-based or activity-based, this was an example from a daycare center where you can see that certain age groups were at capacity, some were exceeding budget, but still had some potential if there was room for it. And so, again, this is an example of overtime against plan and against capacity, if that's the dimension that makes sense. So that was just another example, and you can see that the choice of visualization is important. The decisions around action, red, yellow, green, are important. But the most important part is deciding which are the KPIs that are important to you in your organization. We've left a little bit of time for questions, and I'm going to turn this back to Ruth now, who has been collecting your questions. I think the one that I had even before the webinar started was just about how this process really brings people together. And Ruth spoke of it at the beginning. I want to emphasize that use the dashboard as a way to build the partnership between departments. So if it's finance, of course, the finance department may be driving the KPI definition, but it's also an opportunity for partnership with development, with program, all of the different stakeholders. This is a chance to build it together. Ruth, what other questions do you have?
Yeah, we had actually some pretty interesting questions. The first thing that I would ask you, I think people were really interested in, I guess, a lot of ways in why and how you would break down elements of the dashboard for different audiences. And one person specifically, I can follow this up with a couple of other follow-up questions, but have you ever seen an organization that uses its dashboard in a public way to help kind of its public stakeholders track its progress against promise?
Absolutely. We've actually seen on websites where organizations choose the dashboard visualization to share almost like as part of the annual report. And so if there's a strategic plan for growth or for diversification, it's a way of messaging, this was our plan and this is how we're doing against that plan. I've seen it in annual reports, I've seen it on websites, and I think it's for those organizations, it's part of their transparency strategy. They want to sort of hold themselves accountable to their plans, and this is just a great way to share that.
Okay, and when you, if you're interested, and this is it's a kind of a related question, but if you're interested in the way an organization understands or chooses to understand its own progress, both in program and finances, and you go looking for its dashboard, should you expect to see that anywhere?
This is someone external to the organization. So dashboards are not like 990s, right? So the 990 is a publicly available document, and it is intended to be that way. I think the dashboard is, it's a method of sharing information. It's certainly internal to the organization. Those who choose to share it publicly, that's part of their communication strategy. And so I don't think that I would see it as a sort of right to know. Having said that, GuideStar does a great job of sharing the information financially. There may be other information, but the financial data on the Form 990 is presented in dashboard form as part of their sort of reports that you can download. So if you're interested in a dashboard visualization of financial results of an organization, the GuideStar platform provides that pretty easily. Otherwise, it is a pretty internal view relative to plan and relative to the strategy.
So there was, there were so many questions about this one area of what you talked about that I'm going to try to summarize kind of what people were talking about, and I'm in great sympathy with this because I have a particular way of looking at it, but other people have another way of looking at it. And so the last question I got about this is, why do you need to have a different dashboard for the board and for other staff people? Is that absolutely necessary? Wouldn't it make more sense to have a dashboard that was open to people at every level of staff and board?
And so that's a great question because it almost has two questions built in. One is a dashboard that you prepare for the board should not necessarily mean it's sort of not available for others. It's the highest summary level, and it is the highest strategic indicators for the organization. I think that dashboard for the board should be shared with the whole organization, whether it's in an internal resource, share drive. I think the message the board is hearing is really critical, that leadership and line management and the whole organization for that matter, that's part of a culture question, but that should be shared with everyone else. I think the matter is these are action oriented, and so as I get deeper into the data as the leader of the development team, my indicators are going to be more granular to ultimately get to that summary indicator. So if diversification of revenue is the priority for the board, I may need a dashboard that tells me and we want to grow in individual giving, the development director is going to have to follow some very specific indicators around the growth of individual giving. So think of it almost as building blocks. As the development director, I need to measure the indicators that are going to tell me, am I heading in the right direction, so that when I look at the top indicator, which might be dollars or percentage of total, I've got my sort of indicators along the way. If I'm the head of human capital, I may be looking at things like turnover or compensation study benchmarks or employee morale. I may be having these very specific indicators so I can take different action. The board may only be interested in one, turnover, with the idea that there are a lot of factors that go into turnover. And so it's a building block process, and the more in the detail and in the execution that you are, the deeper that dashboard will be about a very, very narrow point. I've seen great examples where we build the department dashboards as stepping stones to inform the board dashboard. And so it's almost like you can visualize a double, triple clicking into the details. And in this way, we all understand as leaders what we each do to support the actions that are going to get the indicators to be what we want them to be based on the goals of the organization.
Yeah. I think it's such an interesting, it's an interesting point, because I've seen a lot of boards who will just leap from assumption to an initiative. So if we have a bad turnover rate, it's because of this, and therefore let's do more of this. And that may not at all have anything to do with that. It may have to do with 6 other things. And when you kind of move between the individual element of the organization and the board in an informed way, well, let's question this a little bit. Let's test that assumption. Is that, can we test a number of assumptions at the same time to save ourselves time? Is there a way for us to test our hypotheses as we're deciding we're going to go in one way or another because we think it's going to have that effect? So I think that there is this kind of vibrant, integrated dynamic that you can create with the dashboard sometimes, but it requires kind of this sharing of information and a questioning attitude, an attitude that says maybe the assumption that we're making that this is happening because of that isn't that at all. Maybe it's something completely different. And it's an underlying, somebody said here that there are cultural issues here. And there's an underlying curiosity about the work that actually can be played out in the dashboard, that is very engaging for people at every level.
And I think I had one executive director tell me that he looks at the dashboard as moments for celebration. He's always looking for that rather than where did we go wrong, because it's about celebrating that as much as the course correction when things don't go well.
Okay, I have one more quick question, and I know you don't want me to go much longer, but this was a big one for people. We didn't talk so much about programmatic outcomes here. And I think people are really curious about the degree to which you can integrate these two things. And I think what I would ask you is, do you have examples where you've seen that done really well? So that people can see what's that interaction between financial health and sustainability and effectiveness, mission effectiveness.
So I think at the board level especially, we've seen examples where the KPIs are based on this element of financial health and this element of programmatic outcome. It could be education outcomes, it could be performance outcomes. To performance and impact, not always the same thing. But there are, what we want to do with programmatic outcomes is think of them as leading indicators. So if you don't have the attendance that you thought you were going to have, eventually it turns into a financial indicator because you're not meeting the revenue. Or if you have indication around cost per unit, that's also based on programmatic delivery. So I think that we've seen some examples where it's about connecting the right programmatic indicator that's going to be that leading indicator of what is to come. And hopefully, the sooner you see that in programmatic activity, the sooner you can course correct. If we're not meeting our revenue on a performance contract, it's not at that point that we're going to be able to course correct. It's at the point of whatever the milestone is. Workforce development is one where we've seen great examples of if you don't get the enrollment, you don't get the training, which means you don't get the job offer, which means you don't get the offer. So it's understanding how the program outcomes trigger the finances.
And, somebody posed this in terms of a question, but I just want to make it in terms of a statement, which is, that the arc of kind of like when you would see an outcome from an action that you take can be years long sometimes,
Yes.
depending on what it is you do. And so you have to be careful. It helps to, I think, guide conversation at the board level to understand the disconnects between an annual budget and the ability
Mhm.
to show outcomes, and then how do you coordinate that to make sure that you're on track in both ways.
Yes.
And obviously, if people's safety and health and wellness is at stake, you want to make sure that you're mostly on track first for making sure that those outcomes are primary. But if you're not there to do it, then you're not there to do it. And so you have to coordinate that stuff. It doesn't always fit together in tight little time frames. But it opens up the possibility of having those conversations, which I think, is helpful to boards and people who are making decisions inside of the organization. So I'm going to pass this back over to you, Hilda, and thank you so much for revisiting us with all of this. We had many more questions, so we can maybe figure out what to do with them after the presentation if we want to answer them on some other forum, which we will let you know about when we send you the recording of this.
Sounds great. Absolutely. Okay, so we gathered some resources for you. This is a resource in and of itself, the recorded webinar. On the next slide, we've summarized links to the previous webinar we did some time back, and an article. So if you're a webinar learner or an article learner, this is deeper into dashboards and creating them and stakeholders and thinking about them. The next resource is a link to the sort of 9-box rubric where you can download the examples for it that remain under each of these 9 boxes. Again, it's not about how many things can we measure, it's about selecting which ones, and this is just an accumulation of things we've seen be important indicators for organizations. On the next resource page, we have just an accumulation of other resources. That first one was FMA's website, the second one is the Strong Nonprofit, and then the third is an NPQ business model series that is just wrapping up. Some of you may have attended, but if you haven't, this business model series really helps organizations understand their business model, what works, what causes one effect versus another, driven by the revenue source of the organization. And it really would be a great way to think through how to determine your key drivers. I think I was one of the presenters on one of the elements of revenue, and there are various other presenters. I think it may be worth an investment in the series. There's a link there for you to help you sort of think through KPIs given your major source of revenue. So I encourage you to visit that link and take a look at the business model series. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you from FMA, and thank you for your time today and for thinking of NPQ and FMA as a resource as you think through the wonderful idea of a dashboard. Back to you. Just again, thank you. And Ruth, would you like to close?
Yes, thank you all for coming today. It's been wonderful. Every time I listen to one of these presentations, I learn a lot. So we hope you keep coming back. And thank you, as always, Hilda, for putting aside this time for everyone. I do want to tell people we had 1,400 people sign up for this webinar today. So you're in great company around the sector, and the variety of the questions that we got indicated what a vast array of kinds of nonprofits we were addressing today. So I feel like with that kind of appetite for learning, these can only get better and better as time goes on. We'll do a lot more sharing in the future about how people are using some of these ideas. So thank you again, Hilda, and thank you everybody who came. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.